Christ is risen. Christ is risen in us. Alleluia. Christ is risen. What can it possibly mean all these years later to you and me that small group of Jesus followers gathered together and talked about their experience of Jesus and decided in that moment that not even death could extinguish the life that they experienced in Jesus? What difference does it make to you or I that Christ is risen? I guess it would depend maybe on how you look at it. To some, it may not make a difference at all. And to others, it might make all the difference. There are some who will tell you that the only important thing about the whole thing is that you believe it. So we have this story of doubting Thomas. It comes in the Gospel of John, and it usually comes right after this Easter Sunday. We are in the 50 days of the Eastertide season that will take us through May 21st, and then we'll experience Pentecost on May 28th. And there were some, we read this story, and we hear once again, of the disciples, those poor disciples just not quite getting it right. And gosh, that doubting Thomas, we're reminded, don't be a doubting Thomas. Who would ever want to admit it if we were? It's as if doubt is so unholy, so sinful, but yet, if we're truly honest, doubt is so human, isn't it? This binary black or white way of going about belief can be really hard. And Christianity, and maybe not just Christianity, other faith traditions too, at times have put people in a corner, so to speak. Believe or else. And oh, by the way, if you doubt, then you're not with us, you're against us. And if you're not with us, you're not included. And better yet, some of us, myself included, have experienced a faith tradition which espouses that not only is total belief necessary to participate, but our belief must match the right belief, or the way we are told to believe, or it's considered wrong. It just doesn't work. That just really doesn't work. Because at the core of that kind of religiosity, in my humble opinion, which might not sound too humble right this second, is that any one of us as human beings who attempt to put our God in a box that's just big enough for those who think and act and live and believe and maybe vote like I do or we do. How could our God, the most excellent expression of divine love, our God whose ways are not our ways, our God who is beyond our imagination, our God for whom there is really no adequate words to express, how could our God fit in that binary box of right and wrong, my way or the highway? How could any box, that box or any other, ever be big enough for our God? But let's go back to the story. I want to give you a little context about what was going on. So nearly 70 years or so after the execution of Jesus, the gospel writer of John, or the writer of the Gospel of John, wrote the story. Now that writer, some believe that was John the disciple. the beloved one, the most beloved one who ran to the tomb next to Peter, as written in John. Others believe that we don't have enough evidence of that and consider the writer of the gospel to be anonymous. We don't really know. But what we do know is around the time, right? So the writer of this gospel had the perspective of someone who lived all those years and knows what happened and knew what happened, after the moments described in this account of the risen Christ. What most would agree upon is that this gospel story was written to address the fears of the people of that community. After the execution and resurrection of Jesus, things got much worse for Jewish people. The Roman Empire destroyed the temple in Jerusalem nearly 20 years before this gospel was written. The followers of Jesus, known then as the followers of the way, were actively persecuted by the Roman Empire, who saw them as very dangerous. Crucifixion was used to terrorize the nations. Corpses were left on display so that people would have a good understanding that if they stepped out of line in any way, crucifixion was all they could really hope for. This worked really well for the Romans, and it kept people in line for some time. And for a while, as we read in the Gospel of John, the followers of the way, his disciples, the disciples of Jesus, were too terrified to move. Could you imagine? Could you imagine the fear that they had, that had them locking themselves in a room together, not knowing what to do? But the story of John, from the Gospel of John, comes to tell us that something happened when they were in that room. Those disciples had an experience of the risen Christ that empowered them to move past their fear. Death could not contain the power of their experiences with Jesus, and it wasn't long before they were living not as terrorized citizens of the Roman Empire, but as liberated followers of Jesus, banding together in communities of compassion, risking it all for the sake of what Jesus taught them and the vision of the world as God's kingdom on earth that Jesus taught them. That kingdom filled with justice and peace. Those disciples who seemed to always get it wrong suddenly were changed into leaders who began a movement that spread throughout the Roman Empire within their lifetimes and continues to sustain millions and millions of people around the world from generation to generation, including all of us today. I heard a story this week. I heard a story from someone in our Tuesday group who was sharing that she went for a walk with a friend in her neighborhood. And she was sharing how excited she was that she finally found a church, this church that she's been attending for some time now, where she feels a connection to God in a way that she hasn't felt it before, a connection in community, an experience of God that has opened up her understanding and her expression of her faith in her life. And the woman that she was walking with comes from a different tradition, one of the ones I mentioned at a high level at the beginning of my message to you today, that believes that there's only one way, there's only one church, the right church, and this, my friends, is not it. And that friend had no hesitation in expressing her belief in that. And the person who was telling this story was hurt by that, not sure what to do, not sure what to say, like any of us in that moment, right? You have that moment where you're just stunned and you actually don't know what to say, and then you spend the next several days with all the what ifs, all the things that you could have said, that you wish you said, that you're going to be really ready next time to say, but that you missed the opportunity to say, and you wondered how you were going to move forward. That was her. And she thought for a moment and said, maybe I'm just not going to walk anymore. You see, maybe you believe and agree 100% with this gospel account written by John, or in the Gospel of John by maybe John or maybe someone else, 70 years or so after the resurrection, which is some 1,953 years ago. Or maybe you're not sure. Maybe having never seen or heard or been able to put your hands on Jesus the way Thomas did just keeps you wondering a little bit. Maybe. But here's the thing. We can move past these arguments of whether or not this actually literally happened as we read in the Gospel of John, or whether or not we believe in the right way of belief, in the right church, in the right blah, 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 blah. We can move past all of that black and white way of thinking and open ourselves to a spiritual understanding of resurrection. Open ourselves up to the story. What is, you might wonder, a spiritual understanding of resurrection? It's the type of understanding that empowers us to live as Easter people who move past our fears and live lives full of hope, full of peace, full of mercy, full of justice and grace and love. To live the kind of lives that God intends for all of us, the kind of lives that our fear works overtime to keep us from. I can tell you without a doubt that I believe in the resurrection, and I know that Jesus is risen. And I also know that that same power that the disciples used to change the world is available to each one of us. You see, as much as our focus today is on belief, I don't know if belief is really the key point here. Some may disagree with me on that. But I've seen and heard and spoke with far too many people that get themselves so stuck on whether or not to believe or not believe that these miraculous things could have actually happened, blah, 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 blah. And they're stuck. Like those disciples that were locked in that room, they're stuck. But I ask, if you believe it, but we don't live like we believe it, well, then what's the point? The power of the resurrection is an understanding that the power is available to us. You might be wondering, okay, that sounds all great and all, but what does that even look like? I have no idea what you're talking about. That's why I'm back in the box today, not on the floor, because I didn't want to miss anything, which sometimes happens when I go noteless. You see, most of us have experienced and seen resurrection in our own lives, but we hesitate to call something we've seen or experienced resurrection. We only have to look at that story again that Colin shared with us today. That story that was so full, so chock full. It's an opportunity I could preach on for weeks. But focusing in on belief today and resurrection, if we rehear that story with eyes for resurrection to see how those early followers of Jesus gathered together to build communities of compassion, see how they themselves were resurrected along with Jesus as they were lifted from their fear and boldly proclaimed all that they witnessed while following Jesus. We can see resurrection with eyes anew. Let us proclaim and remember, or remember and proclaim, that death did not have the last word, because his followers were raised up to be his body, to be his hands and feet, and so are we, here and now. When we say that we believe in the resurrection, we mean we never give up on hope. No matter how dead a situation may appear, no matter how dead we may feel inside, and man, there are days, right? Days you might feel so dead inside, and you just wonder, good God, my God, where are you, God? No matter what, even on those darkest days, new life is always possible. And living like Easter people, resurrected people, empowers us to gather together to share our gifts and our talents and our treasure for all people. Living like Easter people empowers us to empower one another to rise up. Living like Easter people empowers us to build communities of compassion that welcome all, communities that love unconditionally, and empower people to be all that we are created to be. Let it be so, my friends. Let us move from our own tombs of fear and live as Easter people who live into the spirit of resurrection. May it be so. Amen.